Welcome to the Mana Mental Health Soul Science Podcast, a space where sacred wisdom meets the nervous system. I'm Tanya, a licensed trauma therapist, integrative guide, and you could say a caretaker of souls. Here we explore the healing intersection of neuroscience, embodiment, and spirit. So whether you yourself are a therapist, or a healer, or a helper, caregiver, intuitive, or just a sensitive soul or human being, this is your invitation to slow down, go deep, and remember, healing isn't just clinical, it's soul work. On today's podcast, I want to talk about something pretty interesting that I think we are seeing a lot of in society today. And I think a lot of people are wondering, what's happening? Why is there so much mental illness or mental health issues or symptoms we're having or just trauma, right? It just seems like there's so much going on emotionally in the world, and we're seeing a lot of stressful things happening in the world, and everybody is unique, right? And so everybody's brains, although brains are made up of the same parts, process things differently based on your own perspective and belief systems. And it's very complex. You know, the brain is very complex. But one of the contributors that I would like to talk about that is actually something that has occurred over time through generations is really generational trauma and what that looks like and how that generational trauma is passed down to generations and what that actually looks like. So I want to start out talking about generational trauma kind of in a brief, simplistic form. And hopefully you don't hear the construction sounds behind me across the street. They're building an apartment complex. So hopefully you can just hear me. But generational trauma in simplest forms really is that trauma that is passed down from generation to generation. Now, what can that look like? Well, it can look like cultural trauma, socioeconomic trauma. It can look like patterns, behaviors. It can be parenting your kids in the way that you were parented because you don't know another way. And that's what it often looked like in earlier generations and our ancestors. You know, our family always did it this way, so this is how we're going to do it. It can be passed down in terms of sexual violence or domestic violence, substance use, alcoholism. So it's the behaviors and patterns, racism, all these kind of external things that can be passed down into what we consider generational trauma, right? Family behavior and patterns goes to the next generation and it continues, like the cycle of violence that you see in families. Okay, now that we have kind of the basis for what generational trauma looks like as a whole on the surface, I want to go a little bit deeper than that. Because if you know me, I'm a little extra. And so I enjoy a good, deep thinking conversation. So I want to talk about generational trauma and epigenetics. And actually how generational trauma can be passed down in your DNA. So we're talking about these small micro levels in the body and with epigenetics. So to kind of give you a clear picture, well, as clear as I can articulate, I want to talk about the cherry blossom experiment, and that's from 2013. Now, I'm not a big fan of experiments that involve animals. Okay, let me just say I hate it. I don't like animal experimentation, animal testing. I grossly disapprove of it. But this study is not too brutal. It's not too terrible, but maybe I do just want to give a slight trigger warning about this study. But again, it's not brutal. At most, probably just some mild discomfort to the animals. So I will tell you about this study. The cherry blossom study were done by some researchers at Emory University. And what they did was really try to figure out fear responses and if these or how these fear responses are passed down through generations, right? Okay, kind of like in humans too. So mice were exposed to the smell of cherry blossoms. Not too bad, right? Nice, beautiful smell. But then after a while, over time, or every time a mouse was exposed to the smell of a cherry blossom, that mouse also received a very mild foot shock. Very mild. Nothing too intense, but enough to cause a little bit of discomfort, right? And so over time, of course, the mice developed a fear response to smelling cherry blossoms, even after they stopped getting shocked. So the shocks that they received to the foot was not ongoing, permanent. It was just in a specific time frame to get these mice to have this learned behavior. They associated cherry blossoms with some sort of punishment or pain or fear. And so they would get this fear response, freezing, heightened startle response, we call it hypervigilance, just from, as anybody would. Like, hell, this happens to me every winter in our house because we have dry air, and I will touch a light switch and I'll get a zap, electrical shock. So winter at my house, I've developed a fear response just from static electricity. So this is what happened next. These mice that had associated cherry blossoms with pain were then bred. And here is where things get super interesting. That's really going to drive the point home about how generational trauma works in the DNA. These offspring who had never been shocked or exposed to trauma directly also showed the same fear response when exposed to the cherry blossom smell. Can you believe that? Those mice children were then bred at some point. The grandchildren, if you will, of the original mice carried the same heightened response to cherry blossoms, even though the pain associated with cherry blossoms was 2 generations before them. So this is kind of mind-blowing how this happens, because this has also been shown in actual human studies too, where grandchildren of Holocaust victims or survivors even had heightened startle responses and fear responses, trauma responses to certain triggers that they themselves were never exposed to, but their grandparents were, who were in the Holocaust. So what this suggests is that trauma-related sensitivity can be inherited, not just through the family stories or behavior that I talked about first, but also through biological changes, which we call epigenetics. And that is how your DNA really is expressed. And that can be expressed through lifestyle, nature versus nurture. There's a lot of things that go into it. And so I also want to, take this opportunity to point out really quick that just because it's in your genes doesn't mean that you are destined to have it. Yes, you're predisposed to it, which makes you more likely, but that doesn't mean that you have to suffer something that maybe a parent or a grandparent did just because it runs in the family. Okay, so we have several brain areas that are involved in development. So like when a child is in development in the uterus. And this podcast is going to be really long if I go into all the parts of the brain, but we really want to focus on the amygdala, because the amygdala is the brain's fear and threat detection center. So when the mice who were exposed to cherry blossoms smelled the cherry blossoms and then were shocked, the amygdala lit up with a fear response. I want to point out there's another part of the brain called the cingulate gyrus, and that is the gatekeeper, and it's the part of the brain that makes associations with things. Maybe you had a bad experience with a snake. Oh God, and now you hate snakes, right? Snakes terrify you. So the amygdala and the cingulate gyrus kind of work hand in hand to make associations, which is what happened in the brains of the mice that had this learned behavior of fear with the cherry blossom smell. So what can happen is that when a fetus is in development, whatever is in mom's DNA can pass through into the developing child, into that child's brain. And that child can be born predisposed to just be more sensitive to their environment. I also want to point out that maybe mom never had any stress in her life. She never experienced trauma growing up. And by the time she got pregnant, no trauma, no stress. But then maybe something started happening while she was pregnant and something traumatic happened, or she started going through a lot of stress. That can still be passed on to the infant in utero. The corpus callosum is a part of the brain. It connects the brain's right and left hemispheres. And it is one of those structures that can be affected by prenatal stress exposure. And this is where, let's see, how do I explain this? The corpus callosum really affects a child's neurodevelopment. And neurodevelopment really looks like attention, executive function, emotion regulation, processing speed and learning, emotional development, learning how to communicate, social cues, being very sensitive, language processing, impulsivity. Are you kind of seeing a pattern here where this sounds like maybe on the autism spectrum or ADHD? So that has to do, well, there's a lot that has to do with it, but the corpus callosum that regulates the left and the right hemispheres of your brain gets thinner and weaker the more prenatal stress or history of trauma or mental health issues that have been in the family, particularly the mom, when the child is in utero. Now, I'm telling you all this, and in the back of my head, I know some people are going to wonder, oh no, did I damage my child? Is it my fault? What did I do? So I can see where people's brains might be going with that. And first of all, I want to validate that everybody on earth, you are carrying things that you aren't meant to carry. You are carrying things that aren't originally yours. That is not your fault. Not your fault. Everybody that is born, everybody that ever is right now, will always carry things that aren't theirs. You might carry anxieties or fears or triggers where you have no idea why you would even be affected by that. You know, why do I have such an intense fear of drowning when I've never had a drowning experience? Somebody might wonder, right? Well, maybe it's because you're carrying something that actually isn't yours, that somebody else was exposed to. So we just want to recognize, you just want to recognize that not all your fear, shame, anger, hypervigilance is yours. It could have come before you and was passed on to you. Again, that can be through a family pattern, behavioral pattern, or it could be through DNA. You can separate yourself from it, telling yourself, well, this is inherited, or this is so-and-so's grief, not mine. This is my family's fear. I acknowledge it, but it's not mine to carry. Process and release. There are various therapeutic approaches that can help with that. Just helping to release trauma from your body, rewiring your brain, rewriting your narrative, breaking patterns, cycles. What you are wanting to do is just create a sense of safety in your body first and foremost. And then really neuroplasticity. So creating new epigenetic patterns. Like you're just creating new patterns. That's what you need to do. And that's actually what can stop the perpetuation of generational trauma. There's this line, there's this famous quote. It pertains to women, but literally it pertains to everybody in the whole world. But the quote says that every woman who heals herself heals those women that have gone before her. And that can be for anybody, man, woman, anybody, any gender. Anybody who heals themselves can heal those that came before them. And what that really means is that you are stopping that trauma from continuing. So, you can't always control what you inherit, but you can control what you carry forward. Awareness, boundary, release, rewiring, these are freedom from patterns that aren't yours and ones that you don't want to carry forward. Think of it like emptying a backpack that someone else filled and then filling it with things that nurture you.